The Mukden Incident and Manchuria Occupation. On the night of September 18, 1931, officers of Japan's Kwantung army set a small explosive charge on their own railway line near the Chinese city of Mukden, blamed it on Chinese saboteurs, and used it as a pretext to seize an entire region. Within months, Japan had conquered all of Manchuria, a territory home to roughly 30 million people, and installed the last Qing Emperor Puyi as a puppet ruler of the newly named state of Manchukuo. The League of Nations investigated, condemned the invasion, and issued a report. Japan's response was to walk out of the League entirely. For the civilians of Manchuria, the occupation meant forced labor, resource extraction, and the beginning of a military administration that would grow steadily more brutal over the next 14 years. The Mukden Incident wasn't just a land grab. It was the first demonstration that Imperial Japan would manufacture reality whenever reality wasn't convenient. Unit 731. Most military research programs, even the dark ones, stop short of conducting live surgery on unanesthetized prisoners just to see what happens. Unit 731 did not stop there. Based in Harbin, Manchuria, and commanded by General Shiro Ishii, Unit 731 was a covert biological and chemical warfare research unit that operated from 1936 to 1945. Prisoners referred to internally as maruta, meaning logs, were subjected to vivisection without anesthesia, frostbite experiments where limbs were deliberately frozen and then thawed to study tissue damage, pressure chamber tests, plague injections, and exposure to chemical weapons. At least 3,000 people died inside the facility, with some historians placing the figure closer to 10,000. The unit also deployed its findings in the field, dropping plague-infected fleas over Chinese cities including Ningbo in 1940, triggering outbreaks of cholera, typhoid, and bubonic plague. When the war ended, the United States government granted Ishii and his researchers full immunity from prosecution in exchange for their experimental data. Ishii died a free man in Tokyo in 1959. The Rape of Nanking. When Japanese forces captured the Chinese capital of Nanjing on December 13, 1937, what followed over the next 6 weeks was one of the most documented atrocities of the 20th century, and one of the most contested. Conservative estimates put the death toll at 100,000 civilians and prisoners of war. Chinese government figures reached 300,000. Victims were used for bayonet practice, buried alive in mass graves, burned, drowned, or executed in organized killing contests. Mass rape was systematic, with estimates ranging from 20,000 to 80,000 victims. A small safety zone established by foreign nationals, including, remarkably, a Nazi Party member named John Rubb, sheltered approximately 200,000 people and likely prevented the death toll from being higher still. The massacre was witnessed and documented by journalists, diplomats, and missionaries who were present in the city. The death toll remains politically disputed between China and Japan to this day, but the fact of the atrocity itself is supported by an overwhelming volume of contemporaneous evidence. The Comfort Women System. Between 1932 and 1945, the Imperial Japanese military operated a network of what were officially called comfort stations across 14 or more occupied territories, including Korea, China, the Philippines, Indonesia, and the Netherlands, East Indies. Inside them, women were forced to provide sexual services to soldiers, sometimes dozens of men per day, in conditions of imprisonment. The women were coerced, deceived, or outright abducted. The majority were Korean, though women from across occupied Asia and the Dutch East Indies were also subjected to the system. Estimates of the total number of victims vary dramatically, ranging from 20,000 to 400,000, with 200,000 being the most commonly cited figure, though historians continue to debate it. In 1993, Japan's chief cabinet secretary issued what became known as the Kono Statement, acknowledging the military's involvement and expressing apology. Subsequent Japanese governments have periodically revisited and partially walked back that acknowledgement, leaving the political wound open more than 80 years later. The Bataan Death March. After the fall of the Philippines in April 1942, approximately 75,000 American and Filipino prisoners of war were ordered to march 65 miles through the tropical heat to a prison camp. The Japanese military had not anticipated capturing so many prisoners and was logistically unprepared, though what followed went far beyond logistical failure. Men who fell were bayoneted where they lay, beheaded, or simply left to die on the roadside. Some were run over by passing vehicles. Food and water were withheld for days. The march took roughly 8 days and killed an estimated 5,000 to 18,000 Filipino soldiers and between 500 and 650 American POWs, though casualty figures vary significantly across sources. The survivors arrived at Camp O'Donnell, where conditions were poor enough that thousands more died in the weeks that followed. The Bataan Death March became one of the most viscerally documented American experiences of Japanese captivity, and a central reason why the war in the Pacific was understood differently from the European theater by those who fought it. The Burma-Thailand Railway. To supply its forces in Burma, the Japanese military needed a railway cut through 415 kilometers of dense jungle and mountainous terrain. Rather than build it conventionally, they used Allied prisoners of war and an estimated 180,000 to 250,000 Asian civilian laborers, many of them Tamils from Malaya, as the workforce. POWs worked 18-hour days and were beaten for slowing down. Medical treatment was denied. Cholera, dysentery, and tropical ulcers spread through camps while Japanese administrators refused supplies. Limbs infected with jungle ulcers were sometimes amputated using only basic tools by fellow prisoners acting as makeshift surgeons. Approximately 12,600 Allied POWs died during construction, completed in October 1943. The Asian laborer death toll is estimated between 80,000 and 100,000, though because these workers were less formally documented than Allied POWs, their deaths have received significantly less historical attention. The railway was completed on schedule. The bridge it crossed, the one later made famous by a film, still stands. The Manila Massacre. By February 1945, American forces were closing in on Manila, and Japanese defeat in the Philippines was no longer a question of if, but when. What Japanese forces did in response was not a last defensive stand. It was a massacre. Over roughly 4 weeks, an estimated 100,000 Filipino civilians were killed in Manila, most of them in deliberate acts of murder rather than combat crossfire. Women were raped and killed. Patients in hospitals were executed in their beds. Buildings marked with Red Cross symbols were targeted. Civilians were locked inside structures that were then set on fire, and those who tried to escape were bayoneted at the exits. One of the largest urban massacres of the Second World War, the Manila Massacre remains far less well known internationally than comparable atrocities committed in Europe during the same period. General Tomoyuki Yamashita was later executed in 1946 under the legal principle of command responsibility, a precedent that remains debated by legal scholars to this day. Biochemical warfare against Chinese cities. While Unit 731 conducted its experiments in controlled laboratory conditions in Manchuria, its findings were being actively applied in the field against Chinese civilian populations from 1937 onward. Japanese aircraft dropped ceramic bombs filled with plague-infected fleas over the city of Ningbo in 1940, triggering a documented outbreak of bubonic plague. Similar operations targeted Changde and other Chinese cities with cholera, typhoid, and anthrax. Wells were poisoned and food supplies were deliberately contaminated during retreats. The causal links between specific outbreaks and Japanese biological operations have been established through post-war investigation, survivor testimony, and documents recovered after Japan's surrender. Exact death tolls from the biological warfare campaigns are difficult to isolate from other wartime mortality, but estimates run into the tens of thousands. The operations represented the only large-scale offensive use of biological weapons by any nation during the Second World War. The Sandakan Death Marches. Of the more than 2,400 British and Australian prisoners of war held at Sandakan Camp in Borneo, 6 survived the war. 6. The prisoners had already endured years of starvation, beatings, and forced labor, constructing an airstrip when, in January 1945, the Japanese command began forcing the surviving men on a series of marches through dense jungle to a camp at Ranao, roughly 160 kilometers away. Those who collapsed from exhaustion or illness were shot or bayoneted on the trail. Those too weak to march at all were killed at the camp before the marches departed. The final group to leave Sandakan in June 1945 numbered 75 men. None arrived at Ranao alive. The 6 survivors had all escaped into the jungle before the final march began. The Sandakan death marches represent one of the highest proportional death rates of any prisoner of war atrocity in the entire conflict, and remains relatively unknown outside Australia. The Qing massacre. Following the fall of Singapore in February 1942, the Japanese military launched what they called a purge through cleansing operation the literal meaning of Suk Qing in Cantonese. Ethnic Chinese males between the ages of 18 and 50 were rounded up and screened at registration points across Singapore and the Malay Peninsula. The screening criteria were almost entirely arbitrary. Owning a map, speaking Mandarin, having a tattoo, or simply being pointed out by an informant could result in immediate separation from the line. Those separated were taken to beaches and jungle clearings and executed by machine gun or bayonet. Singapore's government estimates between 25,000 and 50,000 deaths. Japan has officially acknowledged approximately 5,000. The gap between those numbers is itself a political document. The operation lasted roughly a month and was commanded by the Kempeitai, Japan's military secret police, under orders that have since been traced to senior officers in the regional command structure. The Nanjing killing contests. In late November 1937, as Japanese forces were closing in on Nanjing, the Tokyo Nichi Shimbun, a mainstream Japanese newspaper, ran a story reporting that two Japanese officers, Toshiki Mukai and Tsuyoshi Noda, were competing to see which of them would be the first to kill 100 people with a sword. The newspaper covered the contest approvingly, complete with updates on the score. By the time Nanjing fell, both men reportedly claimed to have exceeded the target, making the final tally impossible to verify since the contest had already run over, and agreed to reset and race to 150. The coverage treated it as a sporting story. Both officers were tried and executed by a Chinese war crimes tribunal in 1948. Japanese nationalist historians have argued that the reported numbers were exaggerated bravado rather than literal tallies. The contemporaneous newspaper coverage, including the original articles with photographs, is real, documented, and archived. Treatment of Allied airmen. As American bombing campaigns over Japan intensified in 1944 and 1945, downed Allied airmen faced treatment that technically violated every provision of the Geneva Convention Japan had signed. In multiple documented incidents, captured pilots were beaten to death by soldiers and civilians at crash sites. In the most extreme documented case, staff and faculty at Kyushu Imperial University in May and June of 1945 performed vivisection on at least 8 captured American airmen, removing organs while the men were conscious to observe physiological responses under stress. The procedures had no therapeutic purpose. They were research, conducted in a university surgical theater by credentialed physicians. 30 individuals were charged with war crimes in connection with the Kyushu experiments after the war. Due to a combination of legal complications, destroyed evidence, and the chaotic post-war judicial environment, the final sentencing outcomes resulted in no one serving a full prison term for the experiments. The Palawan Massacre. On December 14th, 1944, on the Philippine island of Palawan, 150 American prisoners of war were ordered into air raid shelters as Japanese guards announced an incoming air attack. Once inside, the shelters were doused with fuel and set on fire. Men who tried to crawl out were shot, bayoneted, or beaten back into the flames with clubs. Japanese forces had received orders to execute all prisoners before they could be liberated by advancing American forces. Of 150 men, 11 survived, most by throwing themselves off nearby cliffs into the sea and hiding in caves or jungle until they could be recovered. Their testimonies, when they reached American command, directly influenced the decision to launch the Cabanatuan Raid in January 1945, a major operation to rescue surviving POWs before the same fate could reach them. The Palawan Massacre is among the clearest documented examples of the deliberate extermination of prisoners of war, rather than their capture or exchange. The post-war accountability gap. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal ran from 1946 to 1948 and prosecuted 28 so-called Class A war criminals. 7 were executed, including General Hideki Tojo. For the scale of what had occurred across 14 years of imperial expansion, it was a narrow net. Thousands of lower-level perpetrators were never charged. Many returned to civilian life and successful careers. General Shiro Ishii of Unit 731, whose program killed thousands in human experiments and deployed biological weapons against civilian populations, died quietly in Tokyo in 1959, protected by the American Immunity Deal. Nobusuke Kishi, who had administered forced labor programs in Manchuria and was imprisoned as a suspected Class A war criminal, was released without trial in 1948 and went on to become Prime Minister of Japan in 1957. He is the grandfather of former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. Germany passed laws criminalizing Holocaust denial and embedded its reckoning with the Nazi period into national curriculum and public life. Japan's approach has been contested, inconsistent, and frequently political. Textbook content covering the Nanjing Massacre, the Comfort Women System, and other wartime atrocities has been revised, diluted, and debated by successive governments. The accountability gap is not ancient history. It is an ongoing argument about what happened, who is responsible, and whether it needs to be said at all. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.